thank you everyone for coming. This is quite a robust crowd. I'm very happy to see you all here. My name is Joseph Stramondo. I'm an associate professor in both the philosophy department and the classics and humanities departments at San Diego State. I am foolish, and so I also chair the classics and humanities department at San Diego State. And then I'm also the director of the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs there. And I'm also trying to write a book, which is in the home stretch. And so that is going to be the Ethics of Choosing Disability, and that is going to come out from Oxford University Press, hopefully within the next year. We'll see how that goes. So thank you. What I want to talk to you all about today is the idea of choosing disability, and one of the central arguments that a lot of folks trot out whenever they sort of start thinking about this idea, which I think on the face of it is pretty controversial, right? Especially when you're talking about genetic technologies, okay? There's a lot of different ways that we can talk about choosing disability. There's lots of ways in which we choose disability in sort of very everyday sense. But sort of one of the most controversial cases that really sparked a lot of controversy and conversation around this idea of deliberately choosing disability was the 2002 case with Sharon DeChesno and Candy McCullough, where they were two deaf women that wanted to have a deaf child. And so they purposely sought out a sperm donor that had a history of deafness. I believe he was third generation deaf, in the hopes of having a deaf child. And so I'm not sure exactly what the trajectory was here, but somehow they got into the news with this. And I think it probably was because they were sort of refused initially by their local sperm bank. And so that probably was the thing that sparked sort of the public conversation about this ambition of theirs. But they finally did find a family friend that helped them out with this. And that was sort of the beginning of the conversation in the United States anyway around, well, there might be some people that want to have disabled children on purpose. And so as a society, how do we think about that? How do we respond to that? And so just some quotes from the moms here. Sharon said that a hearing baby would be a blessing, a deaf baby would be a special blessing. Then Candy said, I would say that we wanted to increase our chances of having a baby who is deaf. And so this sort of shows that they sort of were committed to this idea of having a deaf child, and would go through some effort to have this happen. But it wasn't you could easily imagine other people from other groups sort of having the same kind of sentiment, right? It wasn't sort of some kind of like strange or weird motivation that they were trying to harm their kid on purpose or something, right? And so how do we make sense of this then? How do we make sense of sort of good faith intentions of disabled people who want to make more disabled people? One of the responses that was really common within both the bioethics literature and also just sort of the popular discourse was what is sometimes referred to as the restricted options argument. And so a rough thought version of this that many people might be having right now as they sort of hear this, this case is that more or less you should select against disability, because if you select for disability, you're going to be restricting the future person's options in life in various ways, right? Sometimes this is called the open future argument for folks that are sort of conversant in the bioethics literature. But I think that one way to break it down, if you do the whole analytic philosophy thing with this argument and sort of take it from a rough thought into sort of your premises and conclusions, is to just basically say that the first sort of premise of the argument is that having a disability leads to a restriction in a person's life options. That's sort of the first assumption that you're making when you make this claim. The second is that if something typically leads to a restriction in a person's life options, then it's bad for a person, right? There's this intuition a lot of people have that fewer options equals worse life, right? And then so if you accept those two premises, the conclusion pretty naturally follows. So having a disability is bad for a person, and there is reason to select against disability in future people. And so this is sort of one of the mainstay arguments against selecting disability, especially when you're talking about future persons and genetics cases, right? And so, this is something that I think, if you're trying to write a book about the ethics of choosing disability, you have to address. So here we are. What I want to do is sort of take the back door. Instead of trying to test out the two premises and see if they actually lead to the conclusion that we are considering today, what I want to do is think about what work the argument itself does when thinking about disabled people, okay? And so rather than asking things like, well, is it true that having a disability leads to a restriction in a person's life options? Or is it true that if something typically leads to a restriction in someone's options, that it's bad for them, right? You could sort of take that tack. And if you're interested in that, then you can read chapter 5 of my book. But today, what I want to do instead is think about this common argument that's made around the ethics of choosing disability and say, well, what narrative work does this argument itself do in the popular discourse when we're thinking about disability, okay? And what I want to suggest is that assuming disabled kids will have fewer life options, it kind of turns out is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And so that's going to be sort of the main thesis here of what I want to talk to you about tonight. And the sort of theoretical grounding of that thesis is what's referred to in the philosophical literature on identity as relational narrative identity, okay? And so the basic idea is that the stories that we tell to ourselves and others about disability and what disability means has an impact on who disabled people are, okay? Who disabled people can be and the choices that they can make and what we can do with our lives, okay? And so if genetics professionals, or really anyone else, right? And so I'm sure there are some genetics professionals in the audience today and others that are aspiring genetics professionals. If you tell stories about disability that equate disability to fewer life options, then you're sort of doing this narrative work and reinforcing these narratives that help construct a world in which, in fact, disabled people have fewer life options. So, how does this all work? Well, according to relational narrative identity construction, the two major features are right in the name, right? It's relational and it's narrative. And so when philosophers talk about narrative, we have to sort of really home in on exactly what it is that we're referring to. Because, I don't know, is anybody here familiar with the thought experiment, the ship of Theseus? Yeah, okay, there's a couple people, right? And so sometimes when people are talking about identity, right, they're talking about numerical identity. And so there's this sort of thing about the ship of Theseus, and if Theseus's ship leaves Athens, and then some of the parts get removed, and then other parts get added in, is it still the same ship, and so on and so forth? Interesting stuff, not what I want to talk about today. Okay, so relational narrative identity is this question of how we talk about who we are and what that actually means within our everyday lives, okay? So it's relational because who we are is a function of what we believe about who we are ourselves and what others believe about us, okay? And so that's why the relational part comes into play, okay? And it's also narrative because it's all about stories, right? Who we are on this view, in sort of who we are in the way that matters most to people, I think, has to do with the self as it's constructed through narrative, through stories, okay? So Hilda Lindemann, who wrote a fantastic book called Damaged Identity, Narrative Repair. She was also my dissertation chair, and so I draw a lot from her on various projects, this one included. Describes this relational narrative identity work by talking about it in terms of the first person and the third person, and sort of saying, she sort of says the work of identity construction happens both from the subjective individual and then from the other individuals that we encounter and from society at large, okay? And so from the first person perspective, I'll just quote Hilda here because she's much more articulate than I am. Identities are constituted from the first person perspective through the loosely connected stories we weave around the things about us that matter most to us, the acts, experiences, and characteristics we care most about, and the roles, relationships, and values to which we are most deeply committed. Okay. So that is just basically sort of to gloss that, that's just sort of the idea that to some degree, who we are is determined by who we say we are, right? The stories we tell about ourselves. However, there's also this third person narrative work that's super important, and that sometimes people sort of go too quickly past and don't sort of recognize the importance of, okay? And it's going to be really the key to a lot of what I have to say later in the talk. So equally necessary to our identities is the narrative activity that takes place from the third person perspective. Other people weave the things about us that matter most to them into stories that also constitute our identities. And so what happens here then is we tell stories about who we are, others tell stories about who we are, and then we sort of meet in the middle. Who we actually are is sort of that shared space where the two stories sort of come together, right? Where they agree, in a sense, okay? And so to be a certain way, you need to self-identify in that way, right? You can't only have an identity that is purely constructed for you by others, right? And there's some sort of discussion around here, right, when you're talking about perhaps like a very, very young child, an infant, right? In those kinds of cases, their identities mostly are sort of imposed on them from the outside, right? It's sort of the narratives that their parents and their grandparents and their siblings and their family friends tell about who they are, right? But for the most part, when we're talking about, everyday human beings, there is this sort of self-identification that's necessary in order to do the narrative work of identity construction, okay? But you also need the uptake of that story from others for it to actually take hold and for it to actually be who you are, okay? So the story that I tell about who I am must sort of agree with the stories that others tell about who I am, and for it to actually be who I am, right? I can't claim to be something that I'm not if others sort of aren't in agreement, right? And others are limited in their power to sort of impose various kinds of identities upon me. So a lot of this work, right, when we're talking about both the first and the third person narrative construction of identities, a lot of this work takes place vis-a-vis master narratives, okay? And so master narratives, sort of a fancy sort of philosophical word, you might almost think about them as sort of tropes or stereotypes, right? These are related concepts, not exactly the same thing, but sort of in that general vicinity conceptually, okay? So Lindemann says, or describes master narratives as the stories found lying about in our culture that serve as summaries of socially shared understandings, consisting of stock plots and readily recognizable character types, okay? And so we draw on master narratives all the time. Like, it's not a bad thing that we do this. They're actually necessary, right? If we didn't have master narratives, we wouldn't be able to function in the world, okay? They do a lot of the work to sort of lighten what cognitive scientists call our cognitive load, right? They help us make sense of the world around us, okay? And so they're necessary for understanding our social position, who others are, who we are, sort of how we fit in to our social space, okay? And so they're important for self-understanding, and then they're also, so that's the first person bit, right? But then they're also important for us understanding who others are, right? So they help us tell the story of who we are, and then they also help us understand the stories of others and what we can expect from them, how we can expect them to behave, okay? And what they value and so on and so forth. So, like I said, we do this all the time. From the first person perspective, we make ourselves intelligible to others by drawing upon these master narratives and sort of referencing them as shorthand, right? Whenever I sort of describe myself, if I were to sort of say, well, who is Joe Stramondo? Well, I'm a collegiate sports fan, right? This is a bit of a guilty pleasure in the fall. You know, we have some college football going on. I went to a large Midwestern university, so don't judge me. I'm also a philosophy professor, right? I'm also a disabled person, okay? Whenever I self-identify in any of these ways, I am sort of referencing back to master narratives, right? And I'm sort of referring to different master narratives that give you all a sense of how I describe myself and who I am, how I identify, okay? And so I'm sort of constructing myself from these sort of shared social meanings that Lindemann calls master narratives, okay? So they're not all bad. We need them. They also function from the third person, right? They also function from the third person in that we interpret who others are by referencing these master narratives. And so we understand what we can expect from them, how we can interact with them in various ways by sort of reducing our cognitive load and not, okay, so this is kind of a weird reference, right? But has anybody ever seen the cartoon Bluey? Okay, so there's this cartoon Bluey, and there's this game that the kids play with their father called Born Yesterday. I don't know if anybody have seen this, right? But he pretends that he was just born yesterday, literally. And so they have to like tell him what everything is. And he'll be like, what is this? And they'll be like, a toilet, right? And so since we weren't born yesterday, right, we have these master narratives that we draw upon when we try to make sense of our social interactions, right? And so it would be impossible for us to function without them if we, every social interaction we had, we, pretended or, we literally had no background information, okay? So I don't expect, for instance, my dean to show up to a meeting in a clown suit. So that's why we have the clown here, right? Because the master narrative around being a dean at a university tells us that they generally don't show up to faculty meetings in clown suits, right? Likewise, I don't expect my kids, this is a little bit of an old slide, he's now in the first grade, my kid's first grade teacher to drive a Ferrari, right? Because he goes to a public school, and that doesn't fit the master narrative of who first grade teachers are, for them to sort of pull up to Franklin Elementary in a Ferrari, okay? And so these are sort of examples of how we interpret the world, what we can expect from others as we move through it. Now, all of this is important because, like I said at the beginning, who we are determines what we can do, right? And so the master narratives that we construct around disability largely have an impact on the options that a disabled person has when moving through life and deciding sort of, whether they want, this option or this option, right? And that's because identity and agency are very, very tightly linked, okay? So just sort of simple examples of this, right? I'm not a surgeon, so I'm not going to be removing anybody's gallbladder, right? Like, that would be a terrible idea. You're not a professional philosopher, presumably, and so you can't teach my Introduction to Ethics course at SDSU, okay? And so these are different ways of talking about the idea that someone's identity that they construct, both from the first and the third person, right, who they say they are and how it gets uptake, okay, determines what options they have in life, what they can do, okay? Those are really simple examples. So this is where it gets juicy, right? This is where it gets juicy. Because what I want to suggest is that when someone talks about the restricted options argument, when thinking about disabled people and their reproductive choices, okay? Whether it's, you're talking about a geneticist or genetic counselor or a journalist or whomever, right? They are essentially telling a story, right, about disability, about who disabled people are, okay? And so if they tell a story that says that disabled people have restricted options in their life, then that story contributes and reinforces this larger master narrative that says that disabled people have fewer options in life, okay? And so a master narrative that equates disability to restricted options, and therefore a worse life, is going to in fact be self-fulfilling in as far as it reinforces the idea that disabled people are the kinds of people that have fewer life options and therefore worse lives, right? Again, who we are determines what we can do, right? So this options thing. So let me give you an example, right? Because I think that a lot of this up until this point, except for maybe the clown suit, was pretty theoretical. And so I figure, an example would be useful here. So we might think of the master narrative around disability saying something along the lines of a future person with X disability, you can fill in whatever here, Down syndrome, muscular dystrophy, spina bifida, whatever, will not be capable of ever marrying and having a family. Now, this isn't to say that everyone should marry and have a family, or everyone should even want to marry and have a family, right? But nevertheless, that is something that many people do value, and there is this common master narrative around disability that says that a disabled person will not, or maybe will be less likely to be capable of marrying and having a family, okay? So the result, what I want to suggest to you is that the result of this sort of identity construction of disability that has this sort of baked into it in the stories that we tell about disability, okay, is that people with that disability, X disability, whatever it is, right, often end up having lives in which marriage and children are precluded, both from the first and the third person perspective, right? So how does that work? Well, from the first person perspective, right, if you're sort of told this over and over again throughout your life, then you end up internalizing it, right? And so the identity that you construct for yourself precludes marriage and children, right? And so you might have heard of internalized depression before, right? So this is sort of a reference to internalized depression, okay, internalized ableism, right? Person with X disability internalizes the master narrative that they cannot marry and have a family, and so they sort of restrict their own life options, right? And that they don't seek for this to be part of their self-identity. They don't construct themselves in this way, okay? Likewise, from the third person, and this is where sort of it gets even more pernicious, right? Because even if you sort of do the work of undoing your internalized ableism and, thinking, good thoughts about yourself and about your ability to, have romantic relationships or, have kids or whatever, right? The fact is that in order to be something, right, you need agreement from the third person, right? You need uptake of that identity from others, okay? And there are all kinds of ways, it turns out, that society has organized itself according to the master narrative that people with X disability cannot marry and have children. And so structural ableism is sort of driven by this kind of master narrative and makes it more difficult for people to actually have these life options, right? Because of how they are identified by others, right? If you go into sort of a policy-making discussion with this in your background of your mind, right, around what it means to be disabled and what that identity looks like, okay, then you're going to be creating policies that are rooted in that presumption, okay? So let me drill down a little bit more and talk about sort of what some of the policies are that I might be talking about here, because they might be unfamiliar to most folks. So the first one is a marriage penalty that is written into quite a bit of federal law that drastically reduces someone's, or even completely eliminates someone's state assistance if they marry, okay? And so that's a big one, because especially that state assistance can include all sorts of things, right? Income entitlements, but also things like health insurance coverage, which is like super important for disabled folks, right? Housing assistance, food assistance, and the big one here is home and community-based caregiving, right? Because there's lots of folks that need care in order to stay in their own homes and not be institutionalized somewhere, right? And so for some of those folks, right, the way that they get it is through state assistance. And so if you marry someone and then you lose your state assistance because of that, right, then you lose your care, which sets you up for failure, right, we'll say, for actually being married and like having a healthy relationship and staying, in the community and not being institutionalized. So the master narrative of disability that says that you are really disabled and deserving of state assistance only if you're the kind of person who is not marriage material, right? And so, therefore, we structure things around this idea, right? Well, if you're, if you're so non-disabled that you can do something like get married, then you don't need all of this other stuff, right? Because if you were really disabled, then you wouldn't be, trying to get married and have a family. And so that's what I mean when I talk about the connection between restricted life options, right, and a person's narrative identity and how that is constructed both from the first person, but especially from the third person, and how that sort of trickles down into policy, right? I don't really like the word trickle down because of all of the ways that it's been, used in political discourse. But, in this case, I really do think that it kind of trickles down here into policy. So what do we do about it, right? What do we do about it? Hopefully, I know this is UCSD, but hopefully there are some folks in the audience that are interested in action and not just theory. And so what do we do about it? Well, medical professionals certainly aren't the only ones that perpetuate master narratives of disability in ways that reduce people's life options, but they definitely are part of the problem, right? Sorry to tell you all. I know there are some medical professionals here. But historically, right, stories that are told by biomedicine can and do function in this way, right? Maybe not necessarily the marriage example all the time, right? That one is contributed to by the courts and by, all kinds of things, right? But medicine is part of our cultural soup, right? And so it both is influenced by and influences these master narratives, okay? And so geneticists, genetic counselors, whomever, right, folks interested in genetics, can learn about structural ableism, right? Learn about how it reduces people's life options, in various ways, and then work to tell a different story, right? Work to tell a story about disability, whether it's in clinical practice, when you're talking to prospective parents, right? Not just disabled prospective parents, but all prospective parents, right? In your research, right? In some way, someone's research is grounded in their master narratives that they believe, right? What their research questions are fundamentally grounded in these master narratives, right? What is a disease that's worth studying and why, right? These are related to these kinds of master narratives about disability, okay? And they can either challenge the bad ones, right? Or they can reinforce the bad ones that constrict people's identities and their options, okay? And so what I'm suggesting is that researchers, practitioners, really everyday people, right, can do some of this work of trying to tell a different story about disability and life options, rather than perpetuate the harmful aspects of the disability master narrative that equate disability with a worse life and fewer life options, and therefore have this self-fulfilling prophecy. And so that's what I got for you today. Hopefully I didn't talk too much.
Thank you so much. Great talk. We are going to transition to the panel Q&A. So what I wanted to go ahead and do is just start off with introductions. And maybe we'll start on the end and move this way. I think Joe and I have already given our introductions, so we can go ahead and start.
Sure, I'm Dan Navon. I'm an associate professor in the sociology department here at UCSD. I'm interested in the sociology of science and medicine, and especially genetics. So thanks for a wonderful, enlightening talk.
I'm Brian Goldfarb, and I'm a professor in the Department of Communication here. I've been here about 22 years, and I work on disability, media, and education. I'm also one of the faculty organizers of the Transdisciplinary Disability Studies group that has a mailing list that will send out mailing about events like this. Googie Daniels, who's in the back here, is a graduate organizer of the group, and if you're interested in being on that mailing list, you can look me up on the communication website, bgoldfarb at UCSD, and shoot me an email and I'll add you to the list.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Stoltz. I'm an associate professor at the University of San Diego, and I work in education. And thank you for the talk. I feel like it really helped me understand this is why I do what I do. I work in education to change the way people think about disability and to offer educators counter narratives to what they have learned about disability. So thanks for having me.
Right. Well, I think with that, I wanted to open up the floor, at least for our panelists. Maybe there are questions you wanted to put towards the other panelist or to Joe.
I really enjoyed your talk. It's great. And continues many conversations I've heard you have elsewhere. Like Suzanne, it is what I do, to try and work with people to help develop counter-narratives, alternative narratives. And one thing that I think we've talked about before is the ways in which these narratives tend to center on individuals with disability rather than thinking about disability as something that's shared. And Raina Rapp and Faye Ginsberg have written a lot on families with disability and alternative kinship narratives that exceed the ideas of accommodation. That it's not just about accommodating a disability in your family, but much more about what's gained. And so I guess my question is, beyond simply talking about expanded futures or the idea that limited futures is not even an issue, what do you think about narratives that shift it from disability being something that's centered within an individual?
Yeah, I mean, I think that disability is so clearly not an individualistic thing, right? In that it's a socially constructed thing. But I think that what you're sort of highlighting here is sort of the way that disability, even sort of at the micro level, can be socially constructed, right? And so it's not just this idea of disability being disadvantageous for me because of some policy from Washington, right? But rather disability being something that we can think about in terms of familiar relationships, in terms of friendships, and so on and so forth, in ways that can be more expansive in people's self-understanding, but also in the way they have opportunities to flourish in the world, right? And so, I think that this is crucial, but I guess my worry is that we need to do it in a way that recognizes that there are still individuals, right? Because of intersectionality especially, right? And I think that, when you start thinking about disability in the family, disability in the home, if we just sort of focus too much on, the family as the sort of the unit of inquiry rather than the individual, then it can sort of gloss over different inequities that can exist within the family, right? And so, I know that this is especially true within sort of like gender dynamics in the home when it comes to caregiving, when it comes to, disability and aging within the aging population and so on and so forth. And so, yes, and. Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe building on that same question, what about community? Right, I guess the ways in which smaller communities may have their own narratives that challenge some of the bigger master narratives, and maybe how families work within that or not. And I'm curious if anyone wants to speak to that, or feels that's relevant.
I can. Yeah, no. What I'll do is sort of make the case for the idea that you can't have a counter story of one, right? Wittgenstein, the philosopher, right, has what's called the private language argument, right? In other words, there is no such thing as a private language. All language needs at least two people for it to be sort of intelligible, right? And so, my kids, try to make up languages all the time, and they're like trying to talk to each other in the back seat, like they're pretending that they have this private language, but they don't know what they're saying to each other, and I don't know what they're saying to each other, right? For a language to work, for a story to actually work, it needs to be a shared story. And so I think that communities can be sort of incubators for these counter stories and these counter narratives that can then sort of grow beyond that community, right? And so I'm thinking a lot here about like various pride movements, right? Whether we're talking about LGBTQ pride or disability pride or Black Power or whatever it might be, I think that that's sort of an example of the construction of a counter story that can happen sort of within sort of a communal and familial space.
And I wonder for our audience, for folks who may not be as familiar with those within this context, are there some specific examples, do you think, that are particularly powerful in terms of challenging the master narratives around disability?
I'm gonna look at Suzanne for that.
Okay.
I could go on and on, but I don't want to be the only one talking up here.
No, I'm trying to think of Sins and Invalid.
Yep.
Is a group of performers and activists who challenge the way we look at disability and sexuality, disability and art. So that's a good example. If you haven't seen Sins Invalid, they're a community that also works toward disability justice. Mm-hmm. And so the disability justice movement is another, community of activists, right, who challenge master narratives. I was thinking, too, about just the need for there to be more than one, because there's also a tendency for people to hear a story and think of it as an exceptionality, right? And so having that group means we have to get beyond, saying, oh, well, most people, but this one, wow,
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think that's crucial. Yeah, because you can sort of dismiss the individual as sort of the super crip, right? Yeah.
Well, certainly the deaf culture arguments and deaf gain have been one of the, paramount examples of, claiming non-disability in relationship to difference.
Yeah. I think there's lots of examples that are kind of diagnosis specific that sort of build off of that. I mean, I'm thinking about like the neurodivergence and neurodiversity movement, but also even LPA, Little People of America, which is a community that I'm part of. And so, that is specific to a particular kind of disability that has sort of a subculture built around it. But I also think that there's things that happen sort of even within sort of smaller communities that are useful in sort of constructing these master narratives. I mean, I would make an argument that your research group that you have here is a community that sort of does some of that work, right? We haven't met in a while, but Suzanne and I and a couple other people in the audience here actually, yep, exactly, have a little group in San Diego that meets every once in a while that we call Crips and Shit. And so that's another example. We'll have like a social gathering on a Friday and just sort of sit around and do whatever we do. But yeah, and that's a cross disability, more intentionally intersectional kind of thing, rather than it being sort of as diagnosis specific.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a wonderful conversation. I mean, a lot of these points that I wanted to kind of touch on, when we think about what it means to talk about a master narrative, in this space, go well beyond even just disability rights movements. So if we think about stigma more generally, I was a philosophy major as an undergrad, and then I became a sociologist and started to think less about coherent master narratives and more about how complex and sometimes contradictory all of these narratives, at the first person, the third person, the group, so on and so forth. And agency and resistance, I think, often comes from being able to exploit those contradictions and those inconsistencies within all of these overlapping narratives. And what we see over and over again, whether it's the gay liberation movement or various disability rights movements, is it's that ability for a stigmatized group to come together and develop a narrative in opposition to an oppressive narrative, and then actually start to sort of work into these broader social openings. And it's just something that we've seen so much over the past several decades, and yet we still have so far to go. And I think your talk did a really nice job of kind of illustrating how far we've come, that we can even start thinking about selecting for disability, like what a wonderful thing that is.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, the way that these cognitive schemas get literally written into the built environment, into our bodies, our phenotypes, and how important it is to think about ways to puncture that and basically blow it up, right? And so I think the more you can move away from thinking about master narratives and thinking about just the messiness of narrative life and the messiness of thinking about disability and difference and what the difference is between disability and difference, that's where I think sociologically you start to be able to unpack how things actually change.
Yeah.
And so I'm just kind of echoing from a different perspective.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and so I think that when I'm analyzing the problem, I think it's useful to think in terms of master narrative, but when you're analyzing the solution, I think you need to think about counter stories, right? Many different counter stories to interrupt that master narrative and deconstruct it and challenge it. You're right, it can't be just sort of a counter master narrative, right? Because that's not going to get anybody anywhere. And it doesn't actually do any of the work that we need it to do, because then you have problems around that Suzanne and Brian were raising around individualism and the super crip and just sort of all of these things, right? It's more of a local story that we have to just sort of repeat over and over again.
Now, I know you framed what to do at the end in terms of geneticists and medical professionals and the stories they tell.
Yeah.
I don't know what I think in terms of whether they're actually sort of stronger voices in the sort of contemporary media environment, especially with the sort of rise of patient advocacy and all sorts of participatory media. And so it's not even a clear chicken and egg thing for me. But I know you're doing that partially because of the audience you're dealing with, so. But I do think that that's something to think about, is how these circulate, where they circulate, these narratives. That messiness is partially about that as well.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an audience question as well.
And it's a question of the moment at which the genetics professional gets to make their mark, right? So I agree, in the broader cultural landscape, they might not be especially powerful, but when an expectant family gets a positive result on a prenatal test, they're the ones delivering the news. And so, I mean, your talk made me, I absolutely applaud the idea we should try and move away from the idea of disability and hearing in the phenotype of individual. But as Abby Lippman pointed out long ago when she talks about geneticization in that early work, the fact that something is on a prenatal test is so loaded, it makes non-directive counseling basically impossible, almost theoretically, because it implies that at least an appropriate option is to select against that fetus, right? It renders that genetic disorder avoidable in a way that it was not before it was subject to prenatal testing. But I wondered, is the flip side of your argument that genetic counselors should be able to talk about the way that your likely phenotype might not be the thing that makes you disabled, but society will, because it won't support you, because it won't do all the things that could make it perfectly reasonable for you to expect that this someone with this genotype would thrive. Yeah. And yet society does all these things to make that impossible. And so should counselors be able to speak to that? Because
I think so. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to. He was looking at me as he was saying it, so I want to respond.
And maybe I'll step back in terms of bringing folks in kind of bigger picture maybe. Because two of the questions that I got, and I won't do justice in going over detail of them, but I think one asks that bigger question is, are there more structural things for an individual that even if they have a counter narrative that they're still limited to? And I think we can talk about that. We'd be like, of course, what we identify as the most important. And then I think the other one where a lot of the focus is with genetics and genomics is when we're moving to be able to have greater control over the human gene for an individual, does that then change how much we want to control it? Where most of our conversations are around actually, decreasing what we identify as disease, decreasing of what we would identify as something that would pop up on one of those tests that we've already defined as a variant that we think is not either compatible with life or, as we say, will restrict heavily an individual's future. So I say draw back because often I think is a neat conversation in terms of revisiting what we consider to be disease, but I think that's big for a lot of folks who are looking at these tests and we're like, no, this is something that we've all decided that we put on the test as something that we don't want as a society. Right?
I mean, I think it's, again, important in the real world, companies mostly put things on tests because they can identify them, not because they've made some careful judgment about the implications of that genotype and the actionability or severity or any of that stuff. And so I agree that's what the conversation which we should be having, but that's not always the conversation that informs these decisions. And it's important to be very aware of that because it's a huge issue.
Yeah, and what it really boils down to is capitalism, right? I mean, and so, it's this question. Yeah, right. It's this question of it's not about which disability is going to restrict life options in reality the most. It's more about how many how big is this population? What are the feelings around this that we can sell this intervention, whatever it might be. How fast can we get something to market on this particular thing? Yeah. So I hear you there.
Well, the other big master narrative has to do with dependency rather than life options. And I think that that's a really important one to bring in here if you're bringing up capitalism and what motors it is not so much that ethical position that you're limiting the child's life options, but also what type of a burden is this child going to be?
That's a second chapter of my book, so the social costs argument. But yeah.
But actually, that's, when I talked about the kinship thing in the beginning from Rainer Rapp and Faye Ginsburg, they're really not talking simply about family, because they're talking about kinship narratives that have to do with that burden, but that are circulated in public and in the media. No, I think I see what you're saying. Because there is this sort of equation of disability with dependency that then sort of drives, and it can be taken up by other social movements that are should be sort of natural allies, right? I mean, think in terms of like the feminist movement and how the ethics of care. Right? I mean, you can think of that in terms of, well, we want to have, social structures that support caregivers, but you can also think about that in terms of we want to have the technologies that avoid dependency to sort of decrease gendered exploitation, right? And so, it's a mess. Well, but a third aspect is we want to destigmatize dependency and interdependency. And, one of the other great master narratives that has to do with education that I know Suzanne and I have talked about is always the idea that education is about a trajectory towards some sort of mythic idea of being independent, rather than looking at the social ties within that we're trying to build.
Yeah. I have an exercise that I do with my students that I should probably update now. Maybe you use a different reference, but I call it, "Are you disabled or are you Lady Gaga?" And we go through like all of the different things that someone that is like a pop star, she has a driver, she has somebody that does her makeup, she does somebody that helps her get dressed in the morning, and so on and so forth. And sort of this idea that the identity of the person that receives care is what makes them dependent, and not anything about the actual care that's given.
What I thought's neat in terms of the panel and the discussion as well, at least in my mind, as we think through those master narratives and we think about maybe a parent who's staring at that test, I imagine two things they think about: education attainment and independence, but how far, right, their ability is going to be. And then the other one is medical care and illness. How much are they going to have to rely on resources that may outstrip the individual's family? And so I'm curious for you all who are thinking about that in the context of education, and whether you think support services are allowing folks to thrive who've been identified as disabled. How do you think that conversation kind of integrates into what we're talking about today?
One of the things I think about is the predictions that go into that, right? And a lot of it is prediction and not necessarily based on accurate information in some cases, right? But I'm just thinking about the number of families who have learned, or heard, your child won't do this, and it's that, very limited view where families end up learning, their experience is quite different than that prediction.
And so getting to the point where they're at USD or beyond, and they've already outstripped what the expectations were given them early on.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of like genetic determinism that a lot of times isn't real, that that people operate off of with these conversations. But I also think it's important that we do non-ideal theory sort of in the opposite direction too, right? And so to get back to the question you were asking about, like, should the genetic counselor talk about the socially constructed disadvantages? Yeah, I do believe in reproductive choice, largely because, we live in a non-ideal world, right? And so you can talk all you want about, disability being socially constructed, and it is, but that doesn't mean that it's not a disadvantage, right? And so, when you're making sort of reproductive decisions, it's something to think about for sure.
And so thinking about the different components, right, of both, you have this variant that you may or may not pass on, right, in terms of reproduction, and then you have this variant, as we talked about, what does that mean for you as an individual as you move through the world?
And I think when it comes to educational attainment, it's very important to keep in mind that almost everything we know about truly genetic disorders is absolutely riddled with ascertainment bias. And when you have, say, a young child who may have been ascertained, who knows how, we truly cannot predict their phenotype. We do not have that data. We have unbiased samples of almost zero, like there's Down syndrome and a couple others, and that's basically it. And so it's always important to keep in mind that just at the level of our biomedical knowledge, it's extremely skewed towards what is likely the severe end of a much larger spectrum. And for any, especially a parent, because I think when you talk about self-fulfilling prophecies, it's the educational sphere where that's so clearly going to be the most impactful. And that's where I think it's important to, for a good counselor or anyone who's talking to a family who has this kind of result, to really hammer that home, because we just don't know what the real population spectrum is for any genetic condition, or almost any child.
I think that these master narratives sit within an American culture where the frame of freedom and choice is really pumped up, as opposed to responsibility, community, and a series of key terms. And that really colors those narratives. The idea that somehow we really have that level of free choice, or that we even want it. Faced with a lot of choice, most of our kids are traumatized. So the sort of elevation of choice as, or freedom, is a frame in itself, a certain mythology.
And it's a very cruel framing, because you're asking people to choose between potentially trying to have a child with a disability, but they have to do so in a cruel society that refuses to support them. And that is a cruel American way of setting up freedom and choice, in the reproductive sphere especially.
And you will be judged for making a certain choice, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, to speak to your point about choice, another way that plays in is, at the very beginning of the talk, when I had sort of the premises and the conclusion, right? One of the premises was that it's better to have more choices, right? Which it might not be at all, right? And so that plays into, this conversation at all kinds of different various points, right? This idea of this glorification of choice, whether you're talking about just in general life options, or if you're talking about reproductive choice, or
If you're talking about an education, you give an assignment, you can do whatever you want. It's usually the toughest assignment,
Exactly.
And then maybe as we're ending up kind of talking about, I think, the production of knowledge, which you hinted at UCSD, when we produce a lot of knowledge that's not necessarily applicable. But I think, as you mentioned with Brian, with your work in research, and knowing that just the production of knowledge, right, can challenge narratives, right? And so I'm curious to get people's feedback on the role of research, right, and knowledge around this, and kind of the context where I think a lot of folks are at making these decisions. So specifically about disability later on in life. So a big part of our focus has been at the earlier part. This is the question in terms of developing a disability later on in life.
So, I think what you're talking about is sort of the formation of disability identity, right? And so I think that there's a lot working against older folks when it comes to the formation of disability identity, right? Part of the master narrative, when you think about disabled people, right, is, the paradigmatic disabled person, right, is usually white, usually young, usually male, usually physically disabled, And so, someone who doesn't tick those boxes, right, isn't going to necessarily identify with that narrative, right? And then there's other narratives that are sort of also at play, right? And so someone can have sort of a physiology that is, what might be classified as disability, but not necessarily an identity that's classified as disability, or that they would classify as disability. And so I think there's a lot. It's complicated, but I think at the end of the day, it really might have something to do with that. For that person at that point in their life, ageism is probably more powerful in constructing their identity than ableism. And so, somebody could have the same level of hearing, at 20 or at 90, and the person, at 20 might identify as deaf, whereas the person at 90, is just, a little bit hard of hearing or something. I don't know. But yeah, not necessarily going to the pride marches and such.
I think there's also something about living a long part of your life with a particular view of yourself that then, and I guess it also says something about how you view another, right? If then you take on that identity, that's tough.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's interesting that in some ways, the phenomena that we're talking about in terms of narratives about restricted choice and options actually lead many older people to further restrict their own options, because if they were able to use the assistive devices, if they were to use a wheelchair, that would then be identifying as disabled, and they would rather sit at home than be able to go to the park.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. Just sort of the stigma that attaches to different kinds of mobility aids and different tools and things. Yeah, even hearing aids, right? And you could see it sort of even in the way that it's marketed, right? Where you'll have hearing aids for older folks be as small and unobtrusive as possible, right? Whereas like some of my deaf friends have like neon pink hearing aids that are like, and so
it's also, I mean, there are very real consequences to like taking on that identity. I mean, I can think of it in a family scenario where family members begin to look at someone differently as they lose ability, right? And sometimes really unnecessarily, but this person now is not able to do this, so they should not get the choice.
Yeah.
Restricted
Restricted options.
Yeah.
That's where I'd sort of, you gave the first person and third person aspects, and there's almost a second person thing, which is about that level of intimacy and the face-to-face.
But I think they bring up the question about consent for these master narratives in terms of how much as individuals maybe we give them strength, right, as we engage with them and how we respond maybe on an individual or community level. And then I think the other one kind of bringing up some of the concepts we've addressed before with increasing ability, right, in terms from a biomedical standpoint of manipulating the genome. Should we be more concerned and push back more for folks who may be pushing for less, right, variability, for people who feel very strongly, right, that we should be trying to get rid of what they see as disease or things that don't fall within, right? Kind of two big, very big questions to end on.
Big question. I think the second one kind of relates back to what was mentioned earlier about how decisions are made to shape research questions, right? How decisions are made about what kinds of research we're doing, what kinds of interventions we're developing, and how so much of that does come down to sort of a very sort of profit motive, pragmatic kind of point of view when you're talking about private industry. But I think one thing that's interesting is let's look at the NIH budget, right? There's in the NSF budget, right? It's not just private industry that's making these kinds of choices, right? A lot of it is federal dollars, and that shouldn't be driven by profit motive, right? And so, there is some room for intervention here with thinking about research questions and what kinds of technologies we develop and how, right? I mean, we might not want to just sort of ban certain things, right? Just sort of say, we're not going to research anymore into Down syndrome or something, right? But we don't necessarily need to fund everything, either, right? If the market isn't there for it such that private industry wants to fund it, then why the heck are we going to do it without a really deliberate conversation about whether or not it's a good thing to do?
Great. Well, thank you. I want to thank you all. And I think particularly to Brian, thanks for helping me navigate a lot and getting this together, so I appreciate it. I think Elaine, I didn't thank as well for helping to put this together in biological sciences, a lot of the other medical students in Condo and other folks. So I'm terrible about thanking people who wanted to do that before we break, but we're good. We can have a formal discussion. All right? Sounds good.